everybody. Thank you for having me up here. Thank you, Jill, for starting to give my talk there. Let's see here. Let me tell you a couple other things about myself. First of all, I am a farmer. I dropped out of Brandeis University, the same place I teach now, in 1975 to start farming in the suburbs with kids, growing fruits and vegetables, and I ran that for 20 years. A community farm. It's called Landsake. We grow 25 acres of vegetables, send them into the city, sell them locally through a CSA and so forth. We make maple syrup. We manage the town forest. Town's got a couple thousand acres of conservation land. So our idea was to engage kids with it. And that program is still going on. My own children have now gone through that program. I also co-own a farm in Gill, Massachusetts, just south of Vermont. I drove up from there this morning, where we have been the grateful recipients of some NRCS-equipped grants to build high tensile fence next to the river and stuff like that. So I'm telling you this so that, that's a picture of me in 1975, by the way. That's actually a Grange poster from about 1875, and I could give a whole talk on that agrarian background for what we're all doing here. But anyway, I want you to know that I'm part of this local food movement my entire adult life, 40 some odd years. This is what we've been doing. I'm heart and soul part of this. I believe in it. But the other half of what I do is that I am an academic scholar. I'm an historian, and I do New England farm and forest history. And as an academic, or as any intelligent human being, actually, you're required to be somewhat skeptical, and particularly skeptical of your own fondest beliefs. And so when friends of mine, or when I myself, we start waxing so strong about how we're going to grow all our food locally, they're like, really? You think so? There's, in New England, for example, there's something like 15 million people, mostly in the southern New England states. There's about 2 million acres in agricultural production. 15 million people, 2 million acres in production. You cannot feed 15 million people on 2 million acres. Quite a bit more than that. So if we're really going to talk about growing food locally, we have to think hard about what we're going to grow, how we're going to grow it, and why we're going to do that. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically virtuous about growing food locally. It has to serve some social and environmental benefits. And you have to link the way you're doing it with those benefits. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about. And then you have to look at the sorts of challenges that are raised by agriculture, or in our case, increasing agriculture, because clearly New England grows about 10% of its own food right now by acreage footprint, comparing what we eat here to how many acres it grows. So if you're going to increase that, pretty soon you're cutting down forest. We cut down our forest here once before, and it grew back, and most of us are kind of glad that it did. And so how many trees are we willing to sacrifice to grow more food in New England? And the rest of the Northeast has a little more farmland cleared than New England, but not a lot more, so it's a question that we can extend further along. So let me go through some of this for you. Have any of you been to the Harvard Forest dioramas? I'm going to do a little history. Yeah, it's worth a trip sometime if you're down in central Massachusetts to drop by Petersham and look at these things. They're world famous. In the Fisher Museum, they depict the New England landscape change, central New England, over the past, well, the museum was built in the 1930s, so over the couple hundred years before that. And then there's a whole bunch of dioramas that are exquisite works of art, and they've just been refurbished and cleaned, so it's in great shape. There's a whole lot of them just on good, solid forest conservation circa 1930s, which really hadn't changed that much in terms of what we need to do. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about New England and the way we used to produce food, not for very long, but that's colonial anywhere in New England, central New England period. New England certainly, well, before there were European settlers here, New England produced all its own food. And a very healthy diet was eaten by the Native American people here, indeed. When the English arrived here, they were amazed at how big and strong these people were. but there's 100,000. So if you're thinking about a foraging economy with some agriculture in it, that's about how many people you could support. When the English arrived, 30,000 of them showed up in the 1630s. 5 generations later, there was 1 million of them. They doubled every 25 years. Amazing. I've written about this. Quite a story. Well, they produced most of their own food. They brought in a little rum, a little sugar, but mostly they produced everything they ate. But again, 1 million of them. There's 15 million of us today. So that's a kind of early pioneering look. Now there's something kind of amazing. The curve coming up on the left is population. We're running from 1600 to today. The curves on the top, the heavy green line is all 6 states consolidated, and it's the amount of forest on the landscape. So you see gradually deforestation as farmland is cleared through 1800 through the colonial period, especially in southern New England, and then this amazing plummeting in 1 or 2 generations to the middle of the 19th century. Just as population is beginning to take off, and that's mostly an urbanizing population. So the landscape was rapidly cleared, and then there was this spectacular turnaround in the late 19th century, and most of the forest grew back. And then you can see in the last few decades, it's begun to tail off again as the rate at which we lose forest to suburbanization is outrunning the rate at which agricultural land is growing to forest. So in the middle of the 19th century, central New England looked like that, 75% cleared. Now notice almost all of that is grassland. It's hay and pasture. Most towns had 5% or something tillage. There's a pastoral economy up here. In northern New England and western New England, it was sheep. Elsewhere in the south, it was cattle. And later, it was a shift to dairy. And then, by late 19th century, it looked more like that. You see the pastures all going back to forest. I have some issues with this particular diorama in that the house is shown as in the barn, is shown as being dilapidated. And actually, that's not precisely right. The landscape started to go back to forest in the late, well, why did it go back, anyone? What happened?
Barbed wire, people moved west.
People moved west, right?
Into the cities.
People were moving into the cities. Did agriculture decline? You can tell by the way I asked that you might want to step into that trap. It actually didn't. The thing that happened was the landscape started going back to forest as farming consolidated onto better acreage, and they found urban markets, particularly for dairy. But the dairy farmers were feeding much more imported grain from the Midwest, and running that through their cows and getting year-round production, so that the value of production actually rose into the early part of the 20th century, even as the land was going back to forest. And this is kind of interesting to me if we think about what it makes sense to grow today and in the decades ahead of us if we were going to increase production. It's those things that, they call them concentrated products. It was vegetables, fruits, dairy. They're things that make sense in our landscape, and that's what we ought to have our eye on. But anyway, the forest came back. Oh yeah, that's Concord, Massachusetts around 1900. So you can see it isn't that run-down, collapsing landscape at all. The forest is coming back, but there's there's dairy cows on the rocks on the rocky pasture. There's an orchard on the knoll. It was actually a thriving agriculture in the midst of a returning forest. I'm actually quite inspired by this period. There's the classic story of what's happened to farmland in New England now is not at forest, but at land and agriculture from USDA, U.S. Ag Census figures. And the data are a little noisy, but you can see there's this plummeting in the late 19th century, and then this interesting stability in the first half of the 20th century. At between 6 and 8 million acres, that's between 15 and 20% of the landscape. And then we had this slide in the rest of the 20th century down to where we are today, 2 million acres, 5% of the landscape of New England is in agricultural production. Over 80% is in forest. That's the situation that we're looking at. And again, I've just put this up again to show you that something that's on a lot of our minds is that we've begun losing forest again in the last few decades, and obviously we're not losing it to agriculture. So that was a concern, and that's the basis of the visions I'm going to be talking to you about this morning. And they're not my visions, they're joint visions of a lot of us who work on these things. And the first one was this one, Wildlands and Woodlands. This came out of Harvard Forest, where I do a lot of work. And we did it for the state of Massachusetts first, and in 2004, and we liked that so well, it seemed to have a good reaction to it that we pulled in a lot of other scholars, forest scholars from around New England, and did one for the 6 New England states. There was a release in 2010. There you can see some of the, it's kind of small print, but you can see some of the lead authors on the thing. Basically what we said in this is, look, the forest grew back, it's a miracle that it came back, it's a wonderful thing, we have to keep it. We need forest on the landscape here, it's providing us all these benefits, and we're starting to lose it again. Let's put out a goal it's not just, oh, isn't it great to have more forest, everyone will immediately agree with that, but it's a big number. So we put out a number, which was that over the next 50 years, we ought to permanently protect 70% of the landscape and forest. That's not 70% everywhere. It obviously varies from Boston to the Northeast Kingdom or to northern Maine, but in aggregate. Because of the kinds of benefits that it provides to us, and I don't need to tell you folks what these benefits are, but the next slide lists them. We can talk about infrastructure. Here's some real infrastructure, particularly obviously in protecting water supply, but providing habitat for biodiversity, all the recreational uses, the sustainable wood products that can be produced, and sequestering carbon. The forest, just by sitting there and growing, is sucking down carbon. And we don't know when it's going to stop doing that. At some point it's going to stabilize and reach equilibrium, but it hasn't done that yet. Our forests are typically up here about a century old or a little less, and they're still getting bigger, and they're still taking down carbon. So that's a very valuable thing for them to be doing. So we put this out, and we've been promoting it and pushing it, and states have been taking it up in different ways. It was a way to give conservation groups, land trusts and so forth, a big positive idea about what we're trying to accomplish. Because we're all racing to protect scraps, and I'm on the board of several different land trusts, and that's all great, but we wanted to say, look, there's something out here that's important that we ought to be aiming at, and not just always in a defensive posture. And so that was the idea there. What we said about this, and why we called it Wildlands and Woodlands, is that we do not need to continue to have this big battle within the conservation community that's a century old over whether these should be wilderness or sustainably managed. If you protect enough forest, there's room for both. And the way we split that baby was 10% wild reserves and 90% sustainably managed. Because 10% of a lot is a lot. So that's several million acres of wild reserves embedded in a matrix of sustainably managed forest. And our contention as ecologists, I'm a historian, but I work a lot with ecologists, is that if you manage the forest well, you can get all those benefits of biodiversity and the rest of it from well-managed forests that you would get from wilderness, except for the wild qualities and the old growth qualities. So if you have big wild reserves, actually wild reserves at every scale, embedded in a working forest, you've got a really harmonious marriage. These two things shouldn't be at war with each other. In fact, I wanted to name it Woodlands and Wildlands on the back cover, to go with Wildlands and Woodlands on the front. I was voted down on that, but I mean, we didn't want you to know, listening to us, whether we were at heart, loggers, which actually I am, or wilderness advocates. These things ought to be working together. The New England Forestry Foundation followed up on this, and a couple of years ago accepted our framework and published the Path to Sustainability, and they continue to push this. And their point is that with the amount of sustainably managed forest that would provide, it's a little less than 30 million acres, we could actually double the output of wood products that we're getting now sustainably. There's a lot, as you all know, of very lightly used woodlands around that then get hydrated when someone finally needs some money. And actually the forest products industry in northern New England is in very, very bad shape, as I'm sure most of you are aware, and they're looking for some kind of new stuff to do. And what New England Forestry Foundation is pushing, as a lot of us are, is not so much biomass as buildings. There's new building technologies, where you can start building buildings like this. There's a new classroom building at the University of Massachusetts, the design building. Stop by there sometime if you're in that part of the world. 3 stories high, you can make these things much bigger with cross-laminated timbers and panels. And boy, do you sequester carbon then, because you're locking it up for a century or 2 in a building while the forest is growing more. So there's huge, and you're replacing steel and concrete, which are extremely energy and carbon intensive materials. So a lot of people are kind of latching onto the framework that we put out there to try to push in new directions in terms of the forest industry. Okay. About the time we were doing Wildlands and Woodlands, I was working with a second group of scholars who were involved in food and farm issues in New England. And about that time, the University of New Hampshire's Food Solutions New England, as part of their sustainability program there, started to organize annual food summits and in New England. And we did 6 of them. We did 1 in every state, starting in 2000, I don't know, 10 maybe. And about 100 delegates, several from each state, kind of across the spectrum of people who are involved in nutrition and food justice and farming and farmland protection and all the rest of that, to talk to each other about what issues were most important to us and how we might coordinate on it. And as part of that process, several of us wrote this New England Food Vision. And it wasn't a stakeholder joint, endorsed officially production of that group, but we ran the drafts by them, including up here in Vermont. We had a meeting where we really heard a lot about what we forgot to put in there, so then we remembered. I mean, I learned a lot from it. I'm a country boy. I just wanted to calculate acres, but there's more to it than that. So there's a bunch of the authors for that, including some. Molly Anderson's now here at Millbury. So the question again that was on my mind and that sort of at the heart of this thing though is how much food could we really grow here and why would we do that? What would it be? And I thought, okay, to do that, I'm going to calculate it. So we sort of came up with a number of people, 17 million, 50 years from now, and gave them a diet to eat and calculated the acreage, food by food, to see how much acreage does it take for your broccoli, if USDA wants us to eat 3 times as much fruit, which we should, well, how much acreage does that take? Where's that going to come from? How much of it could be here? What would it make sense to grow here with limited acreage? And where would you get the acreage if you were going to do something like that? So that was, I just wanted to, so the thing encompasses, that's from Portland, Maine. That's a group called Cultivating Community. So it has an urban dimension. And that's from the county. That's from Aroostook County, Maine. So it's all of both of these visions are talking about all of New England, urban and suburban and rural. So here's the heart of the thing. If you're going to be growing more food, and this really applies to forests too, as we were just talking about, you got to identify what it is you're trying to achieve. And so these are the core values that came out of these discussions. And these are widely recognizable to all of us here. But the first one, the central one, is that healthy food is a fundamental human right. That if we're going to have healthy, sustainable food, we've got to figure out how to make it available to everybody. And the second one is that as a society, we should be moving towards healthier eating. We're not dictating the correct diet for every individual person, but just over time, gradually moving in that way. That should be part of food systems work. The third one is that it should be sustainable production, and we certainly here can talk about what that means. We defined it in terms of keeping forest on the landscape and minimizing impact to water and reducing energy consumption and that kind of stuff. And then this ought to be in aid of thriving communities, particularly thriving rural communities. These are very people-centered conservation visions. Yeah, they're about trees and the rest of that, but the real message here is we need people to take care of the countryside. And we have to, and cities as well, and we have to reward them for doing that. And not just make them compete to produce commodities at the lowest possible cost. Because that's not going to do it. That's not going to give us these other values that are identified here.